Okay, well, good morning, everyone. You could respond back, yes. You can tell I used to teach kindergarten, right? Making sure the class is all attentive. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. I've been here 20 years now. Project's been around for 22. And one of the very first policy brief that I co-authored with my friend Pam Baldinger was called Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential. U.S. Energy and Environmental Cooperation. And so the discussion in the piece was how U.S. and China, we're the two big dogs on the planet in terms of energy consumption, also lots of biodiversity to protect. And, in many ways, we're the big kids on the block. And cooperation on energy and environmental issue not only help both countries' economy and environment and human health, but it says a lot for the globe. We're big players. And over my 20 years here, we've had a lot. I'm kind of embarrassed to say, a lot of our meetings have been more on the energy side. So we're kind of trying to rectify that. I'm looking at my National Park Service guy here, trying to rectify that today in part. We have a meeting today, as you all came, so I assume you do know, that it's called Protecting China's Biodiverse Hotspots, the Birth of a National Park System. Also, this year, China is hosting, we believe still, in October, the Conference of Parties, the 15th Conference of Parties for the UN Biodiversity Convention. And I only realized today that the schedule that allowed all of you to attend, that today is National Wildlife Day. I'd like to say I planned that ahead of time, but hey, everyone, happy National Wildlife Day. So today we're going to have a conversation, conversation, but storytelling first, about what's been happening in China in terms of creating a national park system. So opening us up here to tell that first part of the story is going to be Rose Niu, who's conservation officer at the Poston Institute. She manages the planning, execution of all the conservation programs, used to be at managing director at WWF, and then hopped on over to the Nature Conservancy, and you started the whole TNC's biodiversity
China
program. She's it, man. Just know that. This is a woman with good history in creating green in China. And she's going to do a ping-pong presentation with Rudy D'Alessandro, who, he's been in the National Park Service since 2002. So when I wrote Crouching Suspicions, you were crouching and leaping into the National Park. And the hidden potentials of the Park Service. So he provides program analysis and coordination of bilateral and multilateral relationships. And a big part of his portfolio appears to be China cooperation.
That's true.
Even though he does the rest of the world. So we do know that Rudy does not sleep. But when he is awake, he takes really nice photos. So you're going to get treated to a lot of great photos, not like bad home movie, like this is my iPhone photos of my trip. This is better because it's got good stories. So after they finish their ping pong presentation, we have Christina Larson, who I've known for a long, long time. Helped you,
in 2007.
In 2007, got her introduced to go into China, and where she ended up living for 5 years, I believe it was, 6, 7?
I met you in 2007 before my first trip, but I lived there from 2011 to 2018, so I didn't move there immediately.
Yep, reporting for Science, Foreign Policy, freelance journalist, and most recently for Associated Press. I don't know how you wrangled this one. You got to travel around the world and report on national parks and biodiversity protection. So again, another person to be envious of. What a job she has. She's going to continue the story, diving a little deeper into things that she saw at Sanjiangyuan, which is China's first nature reserve. And because I thought, well, it's great, we got these national parks, which is an important mechanism to help system to protect biodiversity in China. But we've also seen over the past decade a lot of progress in China's rule of law for nature, and most notably public interest lawsuits. So he's already listening in on us right now, but Boju Zhang from Friends of Nature is going to talk about what they're China's first NGO, have done a lot of work on biodiversity protection in China, but they've been actually bringing public interest lawsuits to protect animals and protect wildlife areas. So he's on the Skype, and he has a short talk and a nice little video to show you as well. Can you say hi, Boju?
He's on mute.
Oh, maybe he muted himself. That's okay. We're confident he is there. And then closing us as the closing picture today, we have Josher Liu, who's a staff attorney at Environmental Law Institute, and he's partnered. You're doing the ping pong on public interest lawsuits with Bo Chu, and he'll talk a little bit more about not just the NGO cases, but also what the prosecutors are doing. And then we're all going to feel really good about what's happening in China, and then you get to ask them hard questions. Does this sound like a good social contract we have going here this morning? Not. The audience is nodding yes. We're on webcast. We wave to them. Tweet us out, everyone, if you're watching, if you like what you're seeing. So to get things rolling, Rose and Rudy, R Squared, is going to kick us off. Thank you. Let's little applause for this great group. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. I'm Rudy D'Alessandro, the National Park Service, as you know, and I'm the Asia Pacific coordinator, so I only cover a quarter of the world. My chief, Steve Morris, does the rest of the world for us.
Good. So we have the entire world covered in this room.
Sure. Rose and I have known each other for over 10 or more years. I think we first met in the 2005 or 6 when she was with TNC China. I have been working on NPS China cooperation since 2002, inherited an agreement that our agency made with our counterparts in China. And so this presentation is to tell you about both the Park Service and Poston Institute's journey with colleagues in China trying to create a national park system. So this is who we are. You guys are probably familiar with the name of the National Park Service. It's 419 units across all 50 states of the United States, and it's not just Yellowstone. That is the first of our national parks, although not even the largest of our national parks, and not the only model that we offer for visitors or for how we manage national parks in the U.S. Here are some examples of different units in the National Park Service. If you're surprised to see Lady Liberty, Statue of Liberty, she is indeed ours. All the monuments around here in Washington, D.C., they're ours. Anything that's of national significance is going to be ours. And most of our units are historic or cultural units, not national parks, although we do manage the 61 national park units. And this was a great find. Last year, we were celebrating the 40th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And I dug up this picture of Deng Xiaoping visiting Abraham Lincoln's statue, the Lincoln Memorial, in that late December day in 1979, just after we had signed the diplomatic relationship into being. So really neat.
And the first big agreement was the Science and Tech Agreement, which is the big umbrella for all the stuff you do too.
Yes, indeed.
Just educating them on this stuff.
Thank you. About 10 years later, a delegation from Yellowstone visited Chengdu, and at that time they had an informal relationship with Zhujiagao National Park or Nature Reserve. And then we signed our MOU with the then Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development. They have an office, or had an office, of World Heritage and Scenic Affairs. Our office, and my chief Steve is our World Heritage Program Manager. We manage the World Heritage Program for the United States, nominating all of the natural and cultural sites to the World Heritage Convention. And then in 2006, we traveled to Wangshan, Yellow Mountain, to create our first sister park relationship. And these are informal, no-cost, low-cost frameworks for cooperation between parks that are similar. And that relationship continues to this day, and we have 9 such sister park relationships with China. In 2009, we traveled with West Kentucky University professor Chris Groves to South China, to Yunnan, and we visited Shilin Stone Forest. And a year later, they created the sister park between Mammoth Cave and and Shilin Stone Forest, or actually South China Karst. And in 2015, we created one of more recent sister park relationships between Shenandoah National Park, which is 3 hours west of here in DC, and Beijing Baiwashan Nature Reserve, which is also 3 hours west of Beijing. And Interior Secretary Sally Jewell was with us at the time, and she's a great hiker, and she beat us all to the top of this mountain. It was amazing. And then the same year, Rose traveled with our then Deputy Director, Peggy Odell, to a National Park System Development Forum. I think that was in Yunnan? Yeah. Kunming. So Rose has been there for us when we've needed a helping hand. And then we started to do study tours with the National Development Reform Commission, which is one of the major agencies under the State Council that has been working on the National Park System Plan. We've taken them to Grand Canyon, Grand Teton, Yellowstone, Yosemite, Denali, and Rocky Mountain. We wanted them to see a lot of different models of national park management. Everybody wants to go to Yellowstone, but we also tried to get them and did get them successfully to other models. Rose?
Thank you, Rudy. Good morning, everyone. As Rudy described, U.S. and China started exchange on national parks since the two countries recover or restore the diplomatic relationship. But the real on-the-ground piloting national park started from Yunnan province. And I was very fortunate to be part of that effort with the Nature Conservancy. It's a long story, but to cut it short, I was hired by the Nature Conservancy as its first China country program in 1997, and I went back from New Zealand to China, actually to my hometown, to start China program in a little house my parents had in Lijiang. And when we look at this region near my hometown, now it's a very famous tourism destination and also World Heritage Site, 3 parallel rivers. At that time, when we look at the rich biodiversity and also cultural resources and beautiful scenery, we said this is a perfect place to have a national park. But at that time, there's no national parks. So the Nature Conservancy came up with the idea to introduce national parks to this corner of Yunnan. And when we talked about national parks to officials there, they had no idea what it is. They thought, oh, it's just a city parks you can see everywhere. In order for them to understand what national parks are, we took them to a lot of countries, especially to the US. I remember during my career with TNC for 11 years, we took maybe 10 groups of Chinese officials to visit national parks in the US, and then New Zealand, Australia, Taiwan, Mexico. And finally, Vice Governor of Yunnan Province decided, even if central government has not decided to start national parks, but Yunnan, well, he really truly believed national park is a great measure to protect the biodiversity and cultural resources, but also have a sustainable utilization of the resources. So he decided to start that journey. And this photo will show you, it's a picture of first international forum we organized in Lijiang with a lot of experts from China, officials from China, and also some from US. And this is truly China's first pilot national parks initiated by Yunnan government. And if you see this corner, that man in the corner, he is a big man, very high-ranking official, Mr. Qi Zala. At that time, he was governor of Shangri-La County in my area, but now he is party secretary of Tibetan Autonomous Region. And he decided to start first the pilot national parks in Yunnan. And this is the opening ceremony we had. So Yunnan started this piloting national park without recognition by central government. We worked with Yunnan government to establish about 13 pilot national parks. And then in 2013, I moved from WWF to the Poston Institute. Actually, Mr. Poston invited me to start conservation programs in our institute. And we were looking at, high impactful project in China. And then we learned the central government of China decided to start to introduce national park. In the national level, I was very, very excited because I see little seeds we planted in Yunnan start, grow into a tree. So I told Hank we should sign MOU with NDRC, which is a leading agency in central government to start this pilot phase of the national park development. So in the first 3 years, central government decided to pick up 9 pilot national parks across the country. And then later in 2018, they also add 2 national parks, namely Qilianshan and also Hainan tropical forest, which is in the bottom of this picture. So this is distribution of the 11 pilot national parks in China. And from 2015 to 2018, basically, it's a pilot phase of the national park establishment by Chinese government. And this year, Chinese government is going to end the pilot phase and get into the formal official phase of establishment of national park system. And the Poston Institute has been working with NDRC and other agencies in central government to do a lot of work during the pilot phase, and we did a lot of projects on 3 different categories. One is research, because China need to do, to have a scientific foundation for national park development, and we support Chinese experts and international experts to conduct 16 research projects over the 3 years. We conducted 3 training program for a group of Chinese officials in the U.S., 15 days training in the U.S., visiting different national parks as Ludi shows. And we also conveyed 3 international workshops in Beijing. Some of the workshops, Destry here, Jarvis, also participated. And I would like to give you a very quick summary of what Chinese government have been doing during the pilot on establishment of national parks. There are 7 different categories of activities, but first one is really consolidating governance structure. China has 13 different categories of protected areas managed by, maybe 10 different agencies. So it's a very messy situation. In order to improve the efficiency of the whole governance structure, Chinese government decided to consolidate them all into fewer agencies led by Ministry of Natural Resources, which is newly established agency. And under Ministry of Natural Resources, there was a National Park Service, which is established in the National Forestry and Grassland Administration of China. So all the government responsibilities being given to this National Park Service of China. In the future. And also China is also reforming the existing protected area system from 13 categories now down to 3. That's the announcement that China will only have national parks, nature reserves, and then natural parks. Minister Lu of Ministry of Natural Resources announced those 3 new categories. And consolidation and reforming is still ongoing, but decision already been made. And also at the same time, a lot of land within those protected areas owned collectively by communities, not by the state government. So in order to have effective management measures, China is reforming the property right and land tenure registration for those important ecological areas. That's very, very important effort led by Ministry of Natural Resources. And at the same time, they want to unify all spatial planning practices into one agency. They said 多归合一. So all the spatial planning effort on conservation will be done by one agency, single agency. That will also improve the effectiveness of the management measures in the future. And at the same time, China, People's Congress of China is looking at possibility of a new legislation for national park and protected areas. The draft, I heard, already being developed, and it's under review and public comments at this stage, and a lot of new policies will be issued in the near future. At the same time, government realized that current funding level of China's protected areas are very low. So they decided to increase the funding and financing of the protected areas, and finally enhance the management capacity of officials in different level. I'm sorry for very quick summary because only this slide we can talk about it for 1 hour, so I don't have time. I would like to give you a picture, a quick introduction about one project we commissioned to a group of scientists from Chinese Academy of Sciences to identify candidate sites for China's national park system. At the very beginning, we want to identify those areas with the richest biodiversity, most critical ecosystem services and functions. So the dark green area are the ones with most important ecological services and biodiversity. Lighter the green is, the importance is lower. So this is the map of that research a Chinese scientist came up with. And based on this, we use six different indicators screening through those areas and then identify 56 national park candidates on terrestrial ecosystems, and then also 10 candidate sites for marine and coastal wetland national parks. So this is the map showing, and you can see the green dot is for national parks focusing on ecosystem services, and then the pink dot is for most beautiful scenery like that, and then the blue one is focusing on species, endangered species, and so on and so forth. So now I would like to turn it to Rudy to talk about Sanjiangyuan National Park, Palette, which is the first and also largest Palette National Parks Chinese government identified as one of the candidate sites. Poston Institute was approached by Qinghai provincial government. They said 2019, China will end the pilot phase of the national park development, and they would like to do a self-evaluation of their work, but they want to invite a group of international experts to do the evaluation for them rather than they do self-evaluation. So I reached out to former director of U.S. National Park Service, Mr. John Jarvis, and asked him if he's willing to lead a group of U.S. experts, and he said, of course, this is a very exciting project. So we organized a group of American experts, and Rudy is a member of that 5 expert team, and we went to Sanjiangyuan last May, and Rudy will go through the trip, part of the trip.
And Rose was with us as well. And this was a 10-day trip through high altitude because Sanjiangyuan, the Three River Source National Park, is located on the northern Tibetan Plateau. When we landed in the capital city of Xining, we were at 9,000 feet after having just arrived at Beijing at sea level the day before. And then we immediately, the next day, drove down into the first part of the park, a good 7-hour drive, and got up to 12,000 feet. And we were all told to take Diamox or other high-altitude anti-sickness medicine, and we all felt sick for the first 4 days. Headaches.
With the jet lag.
Yeah, it was rough, but every morning we would be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and Director Tian, the deputy director of the park, and this shows you where Qinghai is here in the middle, the red area, is the park itself, with the 3 rivers, which are the Yellow, the Yangtze, and the Mekong River, all flow out of this area, which is commonly called by the Chinese Asia's water tower. And it supplies water for 900 million people in 6 different nations. So it is the size of Texas, the province of Qinghai, which is carved out of the northern Tibetan Plateau. And this was our journey from the northeast in Xining down to Maduo through Yushu, Zado, Jido, all these places. And we were supposed to fly back from Germu, but we ended up having to drive back, and that was an all-day trip. It was amazing to see the countryside. And when you're traveling with 3 veteran retired National Park Service officials like Destri's brother John, we love to see the countryside. We love to see parts of a place that we're not otherwise ever going to see. So this was our group. Several of us from the National Park Service, from Poston Institute, from the Ministry of Environment and Ecology of the People's Republic also, because they had provided the funding through the Global Environment Facility to Poston for us to be able to make this assessment trip. And this is Director Tian, the Deputy Director of Sanjiangyuan National Park. He's based in Xining. in the capital city. So he's not based in the park itself, not proper. And that is because the counties manage the park themselves, really. So we set off on a caravan of SUVs across incredible terrain and getting over our jet lag. And Director Tian marveling at us every morning getting up and being ready to go. And we're like, you have given us a schedule, we will hold to it. So you can see the large distances that we had to travel, and incredible mountain terrain, a fair amount of wildlife on the way there, even near the roads of Tibet. And you can ask us later what these all are, but griffins and wild horses, antelope. We wanted to see, of course, a snow leopard, but there was no seeing that on this trip. We were making too much noise. But this was one of the most spectacular scenes that we saw. We saw yak everywhere, not wild yak, but livestock yak, herded yak. But for us, this was like seeing bison in Yellowstone. It was something that we stopped the cars whenever we could to take pictures. This was actually at a wildlife viewing station that was part of the park. So you'll see fences in some of these places. John, Destri's brother, was very adamant that we're not big on fences. In national parks, there are no fences. Mountains Without Handrails is a famous book written about our national park system. And fences here were meant to keep livestock herd in one place. And a lot of scientists have written about how the livestock, the yak herds, are degrading the ecosystem there. And we don't think that's correct. We think that yak herding has been going on in northern Tibet for thousands of years, and they know what they're doing, and that those fences should be removed. So in the final report that John prepared for Rose to provide to our counterparts in the Chinese government, we recommended these fences taken out and that herders are able to have summer and winter grazing for their livestock. One of the stops along the way, there was a lot of Tibetan iconography, Tibetan prayer flags, Buddhist prayer flags everywhere we went throughout this journey. And in the city of Yushu, which would be a really good place to visit, to travel from Beijing through Xining to Yushu, there's this wonderful new museum that was built after the city had endured an earthquake 10, 12 years ago, and it's in the shape of a giant prayer wheel, a Buddhist prayer wheel. It's a beautiful museum that we visited in there. There are some newly rebuilt Tibetan stupas and structures, and you can see just how high up we were, 14, 15, 16,000 feet above sea level. A lot of mantras written on stones, large. That's a 6'4" man standing there, the former Shenandoah Superintendent Doug Morris, gawking at this. And then Destri's brother John Jarvis is where that lower arrow is pointed in this picture. John is 6 foot tall, and that painted Buddhist iconography is a good 60 feet high. And there was a beautiful photo on the altar when I got up closer to the altar. And if you can't see it, I'll tell you later whose picture that was. More mantras painted on rocks and in the rivers, more iconography. This is Travis Wynn, an American who did river rafting tours down the Yellow River for Chinese officials to get reacquainted with their resources. These are caterpillar farmers. Not everybody wants to spend the whole year herding yak in the remote mountains. These folks will spend 1 month in the mountains acquiring caterpillar fungus and then selling it for thousands of dollars. That is their salary for the year. So I think this is where I hand off back to you.
Thank you, Rudy.
I told you ping pong.
Rudy didn't mention how big the park is, and just to give you a sense of how big it is, it's 12,000 square kilometers. It's the size of 9 Yellowstone National Parks, so it's a huge area. And as you can see from some photos Rudy showed, actually this area is so high in the Tibetan plateau, impacted by climate change. Places are, glaciers are melting, and also a lot of grasses are degrading, and it impact livelihood of local community. So one of the innovations this Sanjiangyuan National Park pilot did is to recruit local community members to serve as community patrollers to work with Park Management Bureau to manage the natural and cultural resources in this area. So this photo shows a group photo our team had with those community patrollers when they have their meeting. And benefit of this innovation has three benefits at least. One is to increase the income level of those local communities who are relatively poor economically. Every month, actually every single household who live inside the park will have one person working as a community patroller, and they're paid 1,800 RMB per month. So it's pretty good income for the local community. At the same time, also it really inspires local community to have ownership of the national parks. And thirdly, actually, because this area is huge and the management staff do not have capacity to patrol around the park. So those local communities who live in the area can help filling that capacity gap. And it's a really great system. As you can see, there's men and also women as the patrollers. And you can see it's John shaking hand with one of the heads of the patrolling. Those patrollers get training systematically, so they know what they are doing. And this is something they wear on their arms to show they are doing law enforcement for the national parks. And National Park Management Bureau even developed an APP for the mobile phone, which is in both Chinese and Tibetan language, so that these patrollers who do not have a high education level can, report whatever they see, like fire, illegal hunting, farming, illegal grazing, and so on and so forth. They can just push one button and report the illegal activities they see during their patrolling activities. It's really wonderful. And they are also designated to certain area one person is responsible to. So it's a very well-managed system. There are total 17,000 community patrollers recruited. And we talk with one of the patrollers and ask them, if you are happy with this. And they said, of course, we are so happy. Even if the money Beijing pays is not a lot, it's about 20,000 RMB per year, which equivalent to maybe 5 yaks they can raise. But they said it's money from government, from Beijing. And the government want to make our hometown as a national park. They have a very deep sense of pride, ownership and pride. So this is a stopping we had to watch wildlife. And this is one of the highest peak we went through. Group photos again. You can see in those high mountains, there are still, in May, there are still snow. And we were so welcomed by local community and officials. Every single stop we had, we went through like 13 counties, and every county government, they will come and give us this hada to show their welcome and respect.
And this was Mr. Niga, who was the county administrator for the park.
Yes.
Wearing traditional Tibetan garb.
Yeah. And this is a fleet of our jeeps. And this is in one of the place which is upper reach of Mekong River. And as you can see, many places have very bad soil erosion, and you can see the river runs red. So degradation of the ecosystem, especially vegetation, is pretty serious. And we see some old people still taking care of their kids. Yeah, this is a wonderful picture because on the roadside, we see National Park Management Bureau also built this garbage station using the traditional architect style. And our report believe, or American expert believe, maybe it's not appropriate to use Tibetan style for garbage. This is a working station of Beijing University, who has been working in snow leopard conservation there more than 20 years, led by a professor there. This is a place called Kekexili, part of the National Park palette, and also it's part of World Heritage Site, and it's also in the upper reach of Yangtze River. This place is very famous. Any Chinese will know Kekexili, because this place is very famous for fighting illegal hunting for Tibetan antelope. And law enforcement there has a wonderful story. This person named Suonan Dajie, he used to be party secretary of certain county, Kekexili County, and he was killed by those illegal hunter of Tibetan antelope. As some of you know, maybe the fur of the Tibetan antelope was used to make shatusha, which used to be very popular in European countries. Expensive. So he fought against those illegal hunting and was killed. He's a hero of conservation in this region. And this is a photo of our group, photo with this young, energetic law enforcement team in Kekexili working station. And we had a lot of meetings with local officials and local management staff on our way. This is one of our meetings, just to show you. And then at the end of the trip, we came back to Beijing and also, do a consultation workshop with experts and officials in Beijing to provide our feedbacks on the Pilot National Parks, and they were very happy about fundings and recommendations from our report. So December last year, we submitted our evaluation report to Qinghai provincial government and National Park Pilot Bureau. They told me they were very, very impressed and happy about the recommendations we shared. And now the report was submitted to central government. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
All right, there's some applause here for this one. And I will never be able to show anyone any vacation photos ever, because you guys had a beautiful trip. So wow. So I know you have questions, but we're going to shift on over to Christina. I have your link that I'll get up, but you can start chatting without me getting that link up.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for coming today, and thanks to Rose and Rudy for the great and informative presentation. I learned a lot, and I look forward to hearing about the river rafting with the Chinese officials. I bet there's some good stories. So between the park architects and the environmental lawyers that you're going to hear from later, I suppose I'm the anecdotal interlude as the journalist sort of telling stories about what it's like to report in Beijing on the environment, and also in Qinghai, including in this park. But I did want to start with a serious point you're probably aware of, to put things in context. We're right now in the midst of what some scientists call a biodiversity crisis. A recent UN report estimated that the global rate of species extinction is currently tens to hundreds of times higher than its average in the past 10 million years. So we're losing around the world our large animals, our birds, our insects. There are a lot of reasons: pollution, climate change, poaching. But for many species, the biggest single near-term driver of extinction is habitat loss. And so last year, together with other colleagues from the Associated Press, I set out to examine 12 ambitious conservation efforts around the world, part of a series that we called What Can Be Saved. And you might see... It's not getting the... It's no worries, no worries. You can Google it if you're interested in it. But we went to Rwanda, we went to Peru, we went to Tanzania, we went to West Virginia. We looked at a whole bunch of different, ambitious conservation projects, including to Qinghai, and looking at China's efforts to develop a national park system. So I guess this is a pretty China focused, knowledgeable audience. Those of you in China who visited China probably know what an incredibly geographically diverse country it is, from the boreal forests of Dongbei to the sweeping deserts of Gansu and the Old Silk Road, the emerald forests of Yuhan, and the highlands of the Tibetan Plateau, which we've just seen some gorgeous photos of. So this is, China, like the US, is a huge, diverse country that there's just so much wildlife there. There's so much at stake. But the country, of course, is also changing and urbanizing quickly. When I was in Xining, the capital of Qinghai, about a year ago, I was shocked by the number of new high-rise buildings, the new high-speed rail station, and all the buildings at night with the flashing neon lights, which, if you've been to Chinese cities, you're probably aware of this, the lights all up and down the buildings, which is quite striking, but it's also quite energy intensive. So it was clear to me that the government is planning for more people and more electricity demand in a region of China that hasn't previously urbanized as quickly, the Tibetan Plateau. So given this, the decision to designate a large swath of the Qinghai region as this new national park, an area that we've just heard is 9 times the size of Yellowstone, is incredibly significant. This means that there won't be mining permits issued, there won't be dams built, there won't be new high-speed railroads built through this area. And that's just one of about 10 pilot national parks, and there may be more national parks in the future. So setting aside this space in a country with so much development pressure is quite significant, and something that anyone who's visited a Chinese megacity will know how many people there are and how fast the economy is moving, with the asterisk that, yes, the coronavirus has put a brief pause on things. Just to, sort of, I guess, envision this in another way. In Beijing, where I lived for 7 years until 2018, between the smog and the city light pollution, I'm not sure I ever saw stars. And many nights, I couldn't even see the moon. But when I visited Sanjiangyuan at night, the stars were bright and clear, and in some places, I could even see a bit of the Milky Way. It was magical. They've just described their experience. It really is. I hope each of you has a chance to visit it at some point. During the daytime, some of the scientists that I met with are using motion-activated camera traps to confirm the numbers of some of the rare and endemic wildlife that lives here, including Chinese mountain cats and snow leopards. I have to say, as a casual visitor, I did not have the time like you to track the snow leopards. I did see a number of the plateau pikas, which are a feisty, short-necked rodent, a bit like the groundhogs of Western China. And you can ask Rudy and Rose about some of the other animals that they had pictures of. One of the scientists I met in Beijing, who said that he was giving input into the selection of which are priority areas, might be someone that you also overlapped with, or there might be many scientists advising the government on this. But Ouyang Zijuan at the Chinese Academy of Sciences.
Yangtze.
Yes. He was the lead scientist for China's sweeping national ecosystems assessment, which used 20,000 satellite images and 100,000 field surveys to examine how China's land use has changed between 2000 and 2010. And so he was showing me maps where they had shown where urbanization was happening, where priority conservation species were located, as well as ecosystem services like safeguarding water supplies and limiting soil erosion. But just think about these numbers, 100,000 field surveys. I was speaking with some scientists based in the US and elsewhere outside China, and they remarked it's the kind of ambitious data-focused project that pretty much only China can pull off. And that's on top of the 20,000 satellite images. So Ouyang's message to me, and I think to the government, was that what matters isn't just how much total land you're protecting, but which lands you're protecting. Where can conservation have the most impact? And so I was really struck by this concerted effort of Chinese scientists to take stock of what natural resources they have left and to try to advise to have science be a part of the decision making for the national parks.
Hydration is key.
Yes, of course. But of course, putting lines on a map to designate a park boundary is only the first step. It's not the final step in creating a park. China already, as Rose alluded to, has in the past had a hodgepodge of different park systems. I was given the number that about 15% of its total land area was already included in some kind of park or reserve. But many of these parks were basically parks on paper, run by, you said, 13 different agencies. Some scientists I talked to, mentioned things like poaching or electric fishing, which is where you shock the water so the fish die, and other practices that are illegal that were continuing to happen in nature reserves in the past. And you've probably seen the newspaper articles time to time about sad polar bears and other animals in sort of theme park, shopping mall-like settings meant to attract tourism. So that's not wildlife. That's obviously not best practices. But in contrast, this new national park system is being designed from the ground up to incorporate new science and global best practices. We heard about the sort of origins in Yunnan and the tweaking of the model. And that's why I think the work of the U.S. National Park Service, the Poston Institute, and others, the scientists I spoke to who are advising the Chinese government, why it's so important helping to share information on best practices. There's a lot of tricky questions like where to build roads, how to manage an inflow of tourists, how to balance tourism and conservation. If this is successful in the way that Yellowstone has been successful in inspiring Chinese people to take pride in the landscape, then we would expect a lot more people would be coming to this area than there have been before. So there will need to be places to stay, ways to dispose of the trash, all of the other, I guess sort of good problems that come if tourism is successful there. And they've just shared some of their insights, and I have a million questions of other details to ask, and I'm sure you do also. So for the HP reporting team, one of the questions that we wanted to focus on, besides talking to the scientists about what were priority areas, was what happens to the people living in and near the boundaries of Sanjiangyuan Park, most of whom are of the Tibetan minority group. There are about 128,000 people living in the park or just outside. And as you've seen from the photos, although this area is not urbanized, it's also not a wilderness. It's not a place where no one lives. From the mantras that you saw painted on the rocks, prayer flags, white stupas, it's obvious that lots of people do live here. And as Rudy mentioned, that these yak herders, many of them have been here for hundreds of years, and their families. And so their grazing animals have been part of the ecosystem for hundreds of years. And I was told that's one reason that most of the landscape is that rolling grassland you see, that there aren't forested areas. So I visited Qinghai in October of 2018, and some of my colleagues did again in the summer of 2019. And one of our goals was to just ask people in the Sanjiangyuan region about how the new park designation was impacting their lives. Because we'd heard about this one family, one ranger program, which Rose alluded to, and we wanted to see what it looked like in practice. Now, as anyone familiar with the Chinese media environment knows, this was not as simple a proposition as it might seem. We wanted to include on our team a photographer and a video journalist, and it took more than a year for us to get the necessary permissions for them to report in Sanjiangyuan. And even then, as a small crew, we were followed by government minders, which probably impacted who would speak to us and possibly what they were willing to say to us. But we did speak with about a dozen households, which gave us a window into their lives. So as Rose mentioned, the One Family, One Ranger program was designed to allow Tibetan families residing in the Sanjiangyuan region to perform tasks related to conservation and park maintenance, such as collecting trash and taking water quality measurements, and to make some money for their labors. This was conceived as a much-needed alternative to prior efforts in China and elsewhere when conservation areas were created by wholesale moving local populations or by denying them a chance to make living, for example, by restricting their ability to graze animals or do what they had done before. And I could tell you of several examples with Yellowstone or parks in Africa where unfortunately conservation has come at the expense of local people. And that happened in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, and in the 21st century, I think universally people feel that's no longer what should be happening. So in theory, each family in the Sanjiangyuan management area can have one member designated as a part-time ranger, which earning about 1,800 yuan a month, which is about $255, or about $3,000 a year, which is, I'm not exactly sure what China's current average income is, but $3,000 a year is significant, especially for a relatively poor region. So in the Tibetan village of...
This is pretty good. I think for rural families, this is pretty good.
Yes. So for example, in the Tibetan village of Yangtze, which is located within the new park, our team met a fellow named Ata, who if you Google the page, or I can send a link around later if anyone's interested, you can see some photos taken not by me, but by our professional photographers of some of these people. So he's a Tibetan herder, and he said his regular income comes from raising cacks and collecting caterpillar fungus. He also leads a team of trash collectors, traveling as much as 20 miles a day by foot and by car, combing the hillsides for discarded plastic bottles as part of the One Family, One Ranger program. And he told us, he invited us in for tea to his home, and he told us he was really grateful for this additional work. He also told us that he felt that he had not been given clear assurances about what the future would hold, because he was familiar with the fact that in the past, in other parts of the Tibetan Plateau, there have been people who've been forced to move. So basically, he said, right now things are pretty good. I wish that I had a long-term guarantee. And what he told us is, I am living in this land. My living is relying on this land. I love this land very much. So he, felt that his identity was very tied to this place. Another person we met with a similar story was named Yangtze. He's a Tibetan herder, also earning money through the One Ranger program, cleaning up rubbish. He is also a nature lover. He volunteers with a Chinese science NGO called Shanshui, which is based in Beijing, and he helps them install and maintain some of these camera traps to photograph rare species on the plateau. So he said, from his main work earning livestock and collecting caterpillar fungus, he can make about 20,000 yuan a year, so that's about $2,800. So he's obviously very grateful for the additional income, which basically doubles what he makes in a year, he told us. But he also said he felt uncertain about the future. He had a son who had been involved, actually, one of his jobs was working on some of the past relocation campaigns. And so while he didn't feel he was targeted now, he just wished that someone would make clear what his future was. He told us, I'm not a highly educated person. I'm very concerned what it may bring many difficulties in my life if I would switch my job and move to another place. So the bottom line is what the Chinese government has laid out on paper sounds amazing, involving local people living in the region in conservation activities and paying them for their efforts. And it's certainly a much better program, Rose described as an innovation, than we've seen implemented in a lot of past conservation areas. So it's really a step forward. But our team, we felt, was only able to get a partial picture of what this looked like in practice. We weren't able to confirm how many people were included. And the people that we spoke to had a mixture of being both grateful and a bit nervous. Some of them said, we traveled with a Tibetan translator. Some of them said, well, the people we spoke almost all spoke Tibetan and a little bit of Mandarin, but not very much. They also felt like the language barrier sometimes made it hard for them to receive news, or that meetings about park management or park decisions were held in places that were harder for them to get to. So it may be in part just a question of giving them the information that they need or including them. But I just felt like that was one thing to keep an eye on, all of us who are watching the development of this park. I mean, really, it's a theme that we've talked about a lot at the China Environment Forum. Public participation, involving local people, making them feel they're a part of decisions, taking care of, their livelihood, but also making them feel that they sort of know what's going on in the future. And these sorts of questions about how do you manage a conservation area that benefits the people living in the park, the people living near the park, the people who are tourists coming to visit the park, as well as protecting the species that already live there, safeguarding them from future threats. Rose mentioned climate change. These are all really tricky questions. And again, part of what our series did is we looked at how various countries were trying to grapple in different regions with them. If anyone was interested in hearing about some of those other examples in Q&A, I'd be happy to. But again, thank you so much for coming, and thanks for everybody's research here.
Thanks. And we'll make sure that we'll post on the website the link to your stories as well, the broader ones. All right, so now, live from Beijing, Boju Zhang from Friends of Nature. I'll get his PowerPoint up, but Boju, you could start talking and just tell me when to advance your slides.
Hello, everybody. Here's Boju in Beijing. Friends of Nature is a China local environmental NGO. We have been working to protect China's biodiversity and nature reserves since 1993. Okay, the next slide. In February 2020, we have already brought 46 environmental public interest litigation accusing companies of violations in biodiversity, climate change, ocean environment, and air, water, and soil pollution, as well as various environmental disruptions. In the past 5 years, hundreds of environmental public interest litigation cases are brought in China's courts every year, but almost none are preventive in nature. They are usually brought in response to environmental damage already incurred. From our perspectives, this isn't good enough. Environmental problems should be prevented from occurring in the first place. Destroyed ecosystem cannot really be restored, as China's courts are playing an ever greater role in environmental governance. Now is the right time to allow preventive public interest in cases. Preventive cases litigation procedures brought up before starting a project or an action that could negatively affect the environment. Friends of Nature has started to push the envelope on preventive public interest cases from 2017, such as green PFOA cases in Yunnan, the expansion of a hydropower station on Upper Honghe River threatens the habitat of the green PFOA, a beautiful and endangered species. A case was brought by Friends of Nature against the operator and challenging the environmental impact assessment report. After the EIA was approved and construction has begun. After accepting the case, construction was halted. I have prepared a short video about the green PFOA case. Please watch this video clip.
Okay, sorry, I think I got behind. Okay, here we go. We got your video. And we tested this before. It does have subcaptions. I'm sorry that we tested this multiple times. I don't know why the sound's not there, but just read the captions. Sorry.
Is it okay?
It's playing, but the music's not, the voice isn't there. Enan, can you go grab the AV guy? It's not on the computer. It's something in the AV. We tested it twice before we started. Can you guys read okay? So it's playing Boju, but the sound isn't there, but everyone's reading the captions.
Okay. So
Oh, no, it's still
Could I
playing.
continue?
Hold on. Or did you want to talk while it's playing?
thank you.
You went to the 6th floor? In the booth? No one's in there? All right, there was some dramatic music there at the end. But it's okay. I felt this meditation moment. All right. So we all read the captions, so I'm about to click to the next slide. Are you ready, Boju?
Okay.
All right, your next slide is up. The movie's over. You all read it. Okay, go for it. You're going again, Boju.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. We went to the green people habitat more than 7 times to investigate and collect evidence. And the case was heard in Yunnan in August 2018. The requests in our lawsuit are simple and clear. We are not asking for any compensation, just a help to infringement, remove for risks, with no blocking of the flow of the river or felling of trees in the reservoir area, and no restarting of construction. A key question in the court is whether or not the hydropower plant, if approved, would inflict significant environmental harm to the public interest. The case generated the heated discussion, with supporters arguing that while China's environmental EIA laws provide processes to assess environmental impacts and to allow the public to engage. In practice, they often become a paper-filling exercise with little review and discussion of potential impacts. In many cases, construction starts even prior to EIA approval. Once construction is underway, it is often too late to stop a project. And the Green People case is ongoing. We are also working to promote this Green People habitat into a new national park in the future. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I've never had anyone talk about peacocks. We've had pikas, antelope, yaks, now peacocks. All right, now we're going to talk about another wild animal here in Washington, D.C., a lawyer. You can start I'll get the PowerPoint up and you can start your talk. You could go ahead and start as I'm.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. My name is Zhuo Shiliu. I'm a staff attorney and the director for the China program at the Environmental Law Institute, or ELI. ELI is the environmental law and policy think tank in DC. It was founded in 1969 before NEPA was passed. So last year we celebrated our 50th anniversary. Berger is a great friend, and his organization is indeed a leader in Chinese NGO world, in pioneering the public interest litigation and use it as a powerful enforcement tool. At the ELI, we had the great opportunity, to work on the Hewlett Foundation grant, to train Chinese NGOs and judges and prosecutors on environmental public interest litigation. So that's how we got in touch with Berger and has been, following closely the development in China as to environmental enforcement with particular emphasis on environmental public interest litigation. And so what I'm discussing today is to share with you about how public interest litigation in China and other enforcement tools may help to protect these wonderful national parks and other protected areas. So
I'll click, you click that, I click this.
Okay. So first of all, as Rose and Rudy, and as well as Christina mentioned, China has been protecting, natural areas for a very long time, perhaps as long as 70 years. But that protection has been under serious problems, such as fragmented regulatory system, and there are, at central level, there are more than 13 agencies, each with conflicting regulatory authorities, and there are also inconsistencies among the jurisdictions, among central governments, provincial government, and the county level. As Rudy mentioned, most of the work actually is conducted by the county level, but they are the most underfunded, understaffed level. And in order to address these issues, the national park system was proposed in 2017 by the State Council of China, as well as the CCP Central Committee. And so in that year, the 10 national parks pilot programs were proposed. So these programs, as alluded by Rose earlier, they were supposed to, protect the most representative ecosystem in China, ranging from northeastern China to protect the, feature species such as armored leopards and
Snub-nosed monkeys.
yes, no, not most monkey. As it's on the lower left, it's beautiful monkey is from Sanjiangyuan National Park in the Hubei province, to the northwestern part of Hubei, and the tiger to the northeast actually is a quite endangered species. It lives near the Chinese-Russian border, and that's also the province where I came from. And all those pilot programs were planned to streamline the regulatory process and to maximize the effectiveness of protection as to conserve nature, the ecosystems, as well as local communities, unique cultures. As mentioned earlier by Rudy, that the Tibetan community rangers, actually, by keeping them there, their unique culture is also preserved. They are part of this broader ecosystem. And but as any protected areas, the national park is still under certain violation and the threats. These are primarily include the illegal mining activities, illegal logging, hunting, and excessive development as to industrial projects or farming. For illegal mining problem is to some extent connected to the conflicting jurisdiction issues. For example, well, in one of the national parks, that I will talk more about some particular legal case later. The central government set the boundaries of a national park in Ningxia back in 2017. But then the provincial governments, disregarding, the central government order that no active, mining activities should be established, they were still issuing, mining permits to businesses, and that caused a lot of ecological degradation. But the businesses were actually getting, legal permits, and what can be done. That's a big challenge. And there are several ways to enforce laws against those violators, both the businesses as well as government officials and even agencies. Several tiers of enforcement here. The first line of defense is this administrative enforcement by agencies such as Ministry of Natural Resources, under which the National Park Service is part of. And also the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which hosted Rudy's visit last year to Sanjiangyuan National Park. And once the administrative finances were not enough to deter violations, the judicial part came in. So as Burji briefly mentioned, his organization started to work on public interest litigation far before the 2015 amendment to the Chinese Environmental Protection Law. But only after 2015, when the Chinese legislation explicitly authorized environmental NGOs to file civil environmental cases for public interest purpose, only when or the large amount of cases were being brought by the NGOs. At each year there were about 60 to 80 cases filed at the court, and much larger numbers than that were settled during the pre-trial stage. At many instances, the defendants, businesses or individuals agreed to the demands of the civil organizations, to start the projects, pay compensations, or do other, measures to mitigate their impact. And another way, which actually bringing more enforcement cases, is procuratorate, environmental public interest litigation. So after this Chinese leadership saw the great impact brought in by the environmental public NGOs, they realized maybe there can be a bigger role to be played by the government forces.
They have more muscle.
Yes, they have more muscle, and they can also collaborate with NGOs. And interestingly, the Chinese legislature realized that, in order to not make the field occupied by the prosecutors, they leave a special status for, the NGOs. So under the Chinese legislation passed in 2017, which authorized prosecutors to file civil environmental cases and administrative environmental cases against the regulators. They made such arrangement under which the prosecutors must wait for 30 days to file a civil environmental cases against a polluter or a violator, for conservation purpose. So just trying to wait for 30 days and to see if any NGOs will bring in a case for this violation. If no NGO comes in, only that time the prosecutors can file the case. This is a very different arrangement to the U.S. system. So in the U.S., if an NGO wants to sue, they must notify the government. If the government jumps in, the NGO has no way to file this case. So under the Chinese system, budget organization like Friends of Nature, that's a grassroots organization, not affiliated to government agencies, was given the preference, to assume the leading role in civil, citizen suits. And for prosecutors, they may file civil cases, in a separate action. They can also combine these civil claims, public interest claims, to their criminal enforcement actions. So we can later see from several sample cases how it works in a national park scenario. And so there are also nuclear options for enforcement. As you know, the Chinese, even the prosecutors sometimes not politically strong enough to tackle certain violations. So you can see back in 2018, the Qinghai national park system had a huge scandal, and the serious violations were identified by the NGOs and local prosecutors. But because it's deeply connected to the wrongdoings of provincial government, it requires the central environmental inspection team's efforts, and eventually, more than 100 senior officials in the province were sacked before illegally issuing mining permits, issuing permits for constructing hydropower projects at the central area of the national park, as well as issuing local rules which are inconsistent with national laws.
Nuclear option, I like
That's
that.
a nuclear
Mama
option.
Beijing comes in.
So we can see, but the central environmental inspection requires the information provided by grassroots organizations and the local prosecutors. So they are kind of still need collaborating with each other. I'd like to briefly go through the 4 cases to give you some impression on how the case is going, and more questions are welcomed at the Q&A sessions. So the first case here is a procuratorate.
Make sure you speak in the mic.
In Qinghai National Forest, which is part of the Qinghai National Park versus Zhangjian. This case was filed in January 6, 2020. So I found this on internet because the local procuratorate office published a notice of intent to sue. They listed the violations here and what kind of actions they want to bring. basically they found some poachers and they confiscated the meat of certain wildlife, and the prosecutor believed that it's a rape case, but they would like to wait for 30 days for any NGOs to use this information to bring their own cases, and they are willing to share with the NGOs on the evidence. And the case, so I have not found any court filings after this, but this can show that in practice the prosecutor indeed gives the preference to the NGOs to take the lead. And another case here is the Procuratorate of Nanping City in Fujian province versus a defendant named Xiao and other people. So this case happened in Ui Mountain National Park. That's one of the 10 pilot national parks.
I've been there.
It's
Beautiful.
It's a wonderful place.
Beautiful.
It's a subtropical forest with lakes and very clear rivers. But this problem here is illegal logging. Certain businesses are trying to build a tea tree farm. So in order to, because the climate there is so good and the water conditions very ideal, but without logging permits, they cut down large chunk of trees, natural forest, and try to plant seeds for tea trees, etc. That's not good for the conservation purpose of the park. So the court trial was conducted in November 2019. And in that case, the prosecutor were asking the court to do several things. The first one is to asking court to order the violators to restore the damage and to repair to replant the natural trees that they brought down. And if the defendant fail to do that, they need to pay a certain amount of money, as ecological damage for the loss of ecological services, as a result of the illegal logging. And the picture shows here, just for the last page. So the person on the right is not defendant; he's the expert witness. So. So in these cases, prosecutors and NGOs quite often bring in expert witnesses to be, examined by both sides. And because of the highly technical nature of environmental public interest litigation, the judges, the quality of the expert witness plays a very big role in the success of the case. And by the way, vast majority of the NGOs, public interest litigation cases ended with victory for the NGOs rather than the defendants. And the next one is in Chengbu Ethnic Miao Autonomous County in Hunan Province. And this case is against illegal hunting. So basically, it's a beautiful bird, the silver pheasant on the right bottom. Well, at least one of those birds were killed by the poachers, and they were caught by the local police. And because of this, the bird is a level 2 protected species under Chinese law. So both criminal and civil actions were filed by the local prosecutor in the same case. And eventually, this case ended in 2019, and so the court ordered jail time for the defendants, and they also ordered, public environmental damage on the defendants. So, and according to China's Supreme People's Procuratorate, back in October 2019, at a hearing with the National People's Congress, so vast majority of SPP's Procuratorate cases were in that category. Most of the civil, environmental, public interest litigation was filed along with the criminal action. So each year, so the number here is between 2017 and 2019, more than 200,000 cases were started by the prosecutor, but the vast majority of them ended before the trial actually started. And about 6,000 of those cases went to courts, and more than half of those were about environmental enforcement. Wow. But still, the SPP in that testimony, they said that, well, this is a tremendous progress, but they do not think this is the ideal situation because so many of these cases was just piggybacked to the criminal enforcement when the more separate civil cases were needed because not all these violations were involving criminal violations. So there's still a long way to go. And the last case here is between CBC GDF with another Chinese NGO the colleagues of Friends of Nature. CBC GDF is also known as China Biodiversity Conservation and the Green Development Foundation. Each year they file more than half of the NGO cases in China. So in this case, again, Jennifer, sorry for your favorite national park in China, the Wuyi Mountain, it also happened there. So this time it's involved bottled water company. So the bottled water company markets itself as we get the water from the purest place in China. So we Mountain National Park. And in order to build the facilities, to get the water and the China other things, they cut down trees without the permits. And the NGOs came in and the case was filed in January 2020, just about 2 months ago, and it's still going on. By the way, in the middle, that's if anybody of you has visited China, I think you are not a stranger to that bottled water. It's a Nongfu Shanquan, it's Nongfu mineral water. And so the litigation, public interest litigation is playing a bigger role in China to protect natural areas and national parks in particular. And but there are this new encouraging development, the two of them here. The first one is in order to make the coordination among agencies for national parks conservation. Sanjiangyuan was taking the lead by setting up, say, coordination offices among the prosecutors, among the management office of the park, etc., so they can exchange information more efficiently. And the second is 2 weeks ago, the Chinese National Legislature passed a binding resolution to ban consumption of of wildlife meat. And they also significantly restricted any kind of wildlife trade. So that's the first step for a more systematic legislation. And so we hope that all these measures can be part of the more efficient and effective efforts to protect China's national parks. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Your heads are exploding with information, but if I can ask my interns, I've got to grab the microphones. I want to have you guys start off some questions because I have tons, but I'm a greedy woman, so I'm going to be generous at the moment. And so make sure that when you say your name, say your name and affiliation quickly, and try to make shorter comments and more to questions, so we're really fruitful. So I should have 2 mics going around the room. Up here first, can I get a second intern to grab another mic? Like, Will, you take it? I need a mic up front here. We'll make sure it's on. Okay. Just hand it to him. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
stay
you for
near him
being
to
here.
take it away.
Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, going to Rudy and Rose. Looking at the best practices that you've seen, you've been looking at the United States, but many other countries that have large national forests and national parks. What are you seeing as how China is evolving the best practices looking across the globe, which China does, and now starting to incorporate some of these best practices? What would be 2 or 3 of the best practices, maybe among the both of you, that really is having the greatest impact, and maybe going back to what Liu was talking about as far as the legal aspects of this? But thank you for being here.
Pass it behind you to Steve. He'll get it next. Okay, go ahead. You can answer.
Rudy, you want me to go? Okay, maybe I will share my initial reaction to your question first. Maybe 2 aspects I think China has been doing pretty well. The first one is to do a scientific research, trying to build a solid scientific foundation for management. I think that one, during the 3 years of pilot, Chinese experts and with the help and support from some international experts have done pretty solid research and scientific work. Second aspect, I would say, is about engaging local communities, because China has huge population size and many of the national parks will have local communities living inside of the national parks. So as I mentioned, this community ranger or patroller practices is very important effort to engage local communities and make the local communities have ownership of the national parks, and also national park will bring some economic benefit to the local communities. I would share these two best practices. Rudy, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of early to see best practices in practice right now, because those parks aren't even officially national parks. They are protected areas, part of 2,500 that are already designated across the country. We're sitting here with the author of one of the U.S. case study on national parks, Destry Jarvis.
Wave to the audience.
We also identified for our colleagues in China authors from Brazil, Germany, South Africa, Japan, Russia, Canada to write case studies for our Chinese colleagues to look at 2 years ago, review, and start to try to incorporate those with their management. But it's still to be seen. It's too early, I think.
I agree.
So we're not going to see, China's Belt and Road taking their lessons yet. But it's nice that you guys have started a very important global conversation with the Chinese on these issues. I'm going to interject before Steve here. You mentioned that there were some marine parks. I was kind of curious what in China, what kind of, can you tell me a story about one or two of them, and like what, because I know a lot of mangroves have been destroyed, and because it kind of leads to, because a lot of these parks that you've pointed to, we even saw some erosion. Is remediation, in creating these parks, are there also kind of plans to help repair them? Because many have been damaged.
Yeah, so as everyone knows, China only has coastal area in the east side of the country, including 11 provinces and municipality. And many people will think about national parks only in the west, where you have a lot of biodiversity and wildlife. But actually, Poston Institute identified one big conservation gap, which is in the east coast. A very important migratory birds habitat and also ecosystem services, because 60% of China's population live in the east coast, and also 40% of the GDP of the country produced by those east coast provinces. So I mentioned we identified 10 candidate national parks in the coastal and marine. One example, Jennifer, is one national park we identified near in South China Sea, where you have a lot of not only migratory birds, but also important remaining, very few area of remaining mangroves near Shenzhen and Hong Kong. Yeah. So we believe it's very important to add those marine national parks or coastal national parks to the system.
And did you make, because when you mentioned migratory birds, like the International Crane Foundation has been in China for a couple decades, it made me think, with the work, Paulson, that you're doing with the Chinese government partners, have you been pulling in some other NGO, international NGOs like ICF to be part of the conversation? Because they've been on the ground for decades.
Absolutely, including BirdLife International. We have been working with them for a long time. And as a collective effort, as a result of our collective efforts, in 2018, Chinese government banned all the reclamations of coastal wetland in that area. And as you know, in those coastal regions, the land is very, very expensive. So to ban the reclamation of coastal wetland is a big deal. But we achieve it as our collective efforts, result.
In your AP story, did you report on any marine parks in other countries, or were you still mainly with the trees in the mountains?
Yeah, I didn't for this project, but actually a couple years ago for Science Magazine, I was writing about a part of the Bohai Bay, I think it was. And yes, I mean, China's, just to put this in perspective, China's coastal habitat is not only important for the birds in China, but for it's called the East Asian Australian flyway, and so birds that that spend part of the year in Russia and part of the year as far away as Australia come through China and use these wetlands, these beaches to sort of stop and get fat on their way between these huge routes. And so people, protecting the birds here is important really for birds across the continent. And I looked at an area, I can't remember the name of it right now, but it was the spoon-billed sandpiper, which was a very rare bird. You're probably
in Jiangsu province.
familiar. Yeah, exactly. And on that trip, actually, I was with a bunch of volunteer birders. This was fascinating to me. You might know that citizen science volunteer birders is a sort of a movement, if I can say that, in the United States and the UK, because it's incredibly time intensive to find these birds and find out how many are coming to a certain place, right? And, staff scientists can't be everywhere all the time, but these volunteers would come, and we were getting out. We wanted to catch the tide rolling in, so we went out at like 4:30 a.m., and they just were there most of the day counting birds, and this data was actually used by scientists in Hong Kong and elsewhere to understand the importance of different habitats. So I was struck by that, the average people who become interested in sort of how their work fed into the science and thus the conservation recommendations.
I would like to add also, you said, all those average people are, contributing to the conservation of those coastal wetlands and birds. At the same time, our boss, Mr. Henry Poston, he talked about conservation of the birds and habitat with President Xi, with Premier Li Keqiang. When he met them, he didn't only talk about financial issues, bilateral relationship, but also importance of protecting China's wetland in the coastal region. And one of the great news, a great achievement we made last year is Yellow Sea, actually region, has been designated as a World Heritage Site. So 16 sites in the Yellow Sea and Bohai Bay will be a World Heritage Site. And China is working with South Korea and North Korea to designate this whole region of Yellow Sea as a World Heritage Site.
Which also makes me think kind of like almost like an environmental peace building kind of area as well.
Absolutely.
Should interject, if you don't know them, Birding Beijing, which is a relatively small NGO, but they've done some cool citizen science projects where they put tags on and people, you can watch how the birds have gone to Africa, and it's just, I just been struck today, with the national park system, such a big educational function, but we're seeing it also from the bottom up, from grassroots groups. All right, Steve.
Hi, my name is Steve Andrews. I'm with the Congressional Executive Commission on China. I lived in Qinghai province for a year a while ago, and I'm still in love with the awesome landscape. Thank you so much for the presentations. I'm very interested in transparency, major transparency issues, as Christina raised with, the 128,000 people in and around the plateau. So I'm curious, so the U.S. government as well has problems with transparency. So in terms of Rudy, I was trying to find your report, and I hope it's public, and I think it should be, but I couldn't find it. So I'm curious whether your report's public or if you'll make it public in terms of your recommendations. And then sort of related, my understanding is topographic maps as well as geologic maps in China are still considered state secret. So I'm curious whether sort of you've been whether there's been any developments on that issue, and particularly also even around national parks. I mean, understanding the topography is really important for everyone. So I'm curious whether that's still the case and whether you're pushing for relaxation of sort of these restrictions on accessing maps in these areas. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And someone collect his mic, please. Okay.
Yeah, I can talk, but you go ahead.
So, my report, we've just changed over from Google to Microsoft, so our intranet is a mess. But I can easily share my report, my personal report, as well as the Poston report to the PRC on our recommendations for Sanjiangyuan maps.
We can link that onto our website too, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we will link it on our website. As we'll also get the silent video. We'll have. It's really moving music. We'll put that on our website too. Okay, go ahead, Rose. Rudy.
Well, I would say this official report we submitted to Qinghai provincial government, I will ask them if they are willing to share publicly. But I was confirmed that report will send to the Office of Deepening Reform of the CPC. So it's a pretty high level government, the highest level of government leading the national park development. About the map, I would say this is a problem. I've been working with TNC, WWF, and now Poston Institute on conservation in China for more than 20 years. Access maps is a big deal, and it's still not easy, especially if you are foreign NGOs.
There's that. All right, how about, let's gather 2 questions, so we'll do, so Karen, you get those 2
But I
folks
will
there.
mention one thing we are making. We are making a big effort to help engaging public into the conservation of birds. So we are developing APP, which you can use, everyone can use on your website and record the birds you see. It's like eBird. If those birders here, you will know eBird. We are developing Chinese version of eBird and will be released next month.
Nice. And we'll put that on our website. So we're going to gather 2 questions. And don't forget that Boju Zhang is awake in Beijing trying to get ready to answer your questions. Okay.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for this, and thank you to the China Environment Forum. My name is Hannah Fairbank, and I'm the Asia Regional Coordinator and a Biodiversity Specialist for the Global Environment Facility. So I just wanted to give Rudy a shout out for giving us a shout out for our support of the establishment and reform of the Chinese National Park System. We're really excited to be partnering in that, and also migratory bird conservation. So it's great to hear the prominence of that. So I have lots of questions. I'm going to limit it to 2.
Okay.
One is very excited to see the outcome of the assessment that you all did. But my questions are actually one for Boju, which is, do you see, I'm looking at the blank Skype screen up here, but do you see opportunities for more upstream engagement in shaping the course of large infrastructure projects and other projects that you all are working on from that perspective? So I'm looking at the upstream prior to dam construction, which is, as you said, potentially too late. And my other question is, does anybody have any sense of whether traditional Chinese medicine is being currently considered from the wildlife consumption ban that I think somebody mentioned earlier? So the traditional Chinese medicine use of wildlife, is that being considered at all? Thank you so much.
Okay,
and
and
thank
we'll
you for the photos too. Made me very envious.
Yes. And grab one more person's questions. Right here. The man of the hour. We're going to gather one more question, then we'll answer the 3 in a row to be a little more efficient.
I'm Destry Jarvis. I've spent the last 48 years working on national parks in the U.S. and around the world. 3 trips to China at Paulson's behest, and author of the U.S. contribution to the 8 park system models that they had to consider and shape their own system with. But I think there are 2 fundamental things to create a national park system that I'm not certain are in place yet. One is to have an organic statute that makes it a truly national park system where federal, national laws apply to those parks. And the second is to have a professionally trained national park agency, National Park Service, with law enforcement capability. I mean, U.S. park rangers are federal law enforcement officers. When there are violations of poaching or timbering or whatever, the Park Service itself stops it or files a lawsuit. And it's only when the agency fails to act that the NGOs step in and file a lawsuit against the Park Service, which I've done many times. And I think, many of the examples that we heard sound to me like the central government has not taken control sufficiently. And if it's going to have a national park system, the central government needs to be in control.
Okay. Good comments and a couple questions. Do you have a question for these guys or no?
Well, they know what
They know what you're saying. All right. All right, well, let's just, how about Boju? Could you jump in on the question about, do you see opportunities for the NGOs to kind of jump in earlier with their public interest lawsuits in infrastructure projects?
Thank you, Jennifer. In addition to Yunnan, I think the Qinghai River and the Upper Yangtze River is undergoing intensive hydropower projects and development. And in the same time, the Chinese central government has further strengthened the role of law in the environment. So I think there is an opportunity for the local NGO and to protect the the stream by the lawsuit or other strategy and other ways. Of course, or most of this is that there's no illegal act in the upper rivers, and we do not need to sue.
Okay, I think,
you.
well, maybe Joshua could jump in. I think what you meant by upstream is not just physically up on a river, but at the beginning when a project's being developed. Like if you're going to, I don't know, hypothetically, build a aluminum processing plant in a national park, that maybe that the NGOs could jump in sooner if, I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah.
So, but you
Yeah.
actually,
And,
because you have first-hand experience, you can say more about your environmental impact assessment participation experience.
Yeah, and in China, in the recent years, not just project-based EIA, they also have a planning environmental impact assessment we have seen, and strategic environmental impact assessment. And for example, in the last year, in Qilianshan National Park, they have the plan, the strategic planning for this national park, and we also have sent our idea and or suggestion to the Qilianshan National Park, the Bureau of the National Park, and they suggest they received around half of our suggestion to the final planning. So I think that's a new opportunity for the planning and also for the planning EIA.
And also, I wanted to question, so, I mean, Friends of Nature, I mean, you're the first NGO, and you guys have a lot of power and a broad network. But, I mean, in terms of both, like, these kind of EIA cases and also the public interest lawsuits, I mean, how many other NGOs have your power? Right, I have the right, I mean...
It's not easy for the planning EIA because it's not the same for the project-based EIA. In my perspective, around half of the local environmental NGO have capacity to involve the project-based EIA issues. But for the planning EIA, because for Friends of Nature, we have around 5 or 6 times in the last year for the planning EIA, and we cannot find more than 3 local NGO have full capacity to involve it. And there is another new organization named CECA, they're in the Guangdong and Hong Kong. They have some of the young people, young professions. Yeah. Then the CECA have a major issue, major project for the planning and planning EIA. I think it's a good field for the Chinese NGO and not only Chinese NGO and some international groups to promote. And there are also lack of the public participate in this field.
Okay, well, good. Thank you for those comments. The other question we had was about the traditional Chinese medicine folks and the looks like there's been that they want to ban illegal wildlife trade again. As the TCM community being, I guess the question was, are they being involved in this? Are they being targeted? Are they an exemption? Do any of you guys know?
The Poston Institute hasn't been working on that issue specifically, Hannah, but I learned one of our partner, actually Professor Lu Zhi from Beijing University, she has been working hard in the past 2 or 3 months to get this law passed, and some of the traditional medicine people use came from endangered species and wildlife, so those will be banned for sure.
And if you don't know them, I can hook you up with Luger and now Grace Gabriel from IF. If you don't know her, we're going to try to grab Grace if she's busy right now, but to get her come talk in the summer. Did you have something to add on the
Yes,
TCM?
Hannah, just so I think one quick word to supplement. And because I have not seen the full version of the MPC Standing Committee resolution on banning consumption of wildlife. So there are still details to be seen in it itself or in the future legislation. But I think by far one thing that's clear is that this ban is mostly on land-based animals rather than ocean. So wild caught fish and other species probably are not under the scope of this MPC ban issued last week. So definitely we need to watch this. And another factor is because of this the coronavirus, people in China, particularly young generations, paying attention to whether traditional medicine is effective or certain ingredients in the traditional medicine spectrum actually is bad for the system or sustainability. Certain ingredients probably are too close to certain wildlife, like bats, and there maybe needs to be some adjustment to what people can use for traditional medicine in the future.
Okay, good.
I have one thing to add. So the NGO that you mentioned with the long acronym CBCGTF, I met them in Beijing, and they actually they have a number of public interest lawsuits to try to stop the pangolin trade. Pangolin, of course, is the little scaly animal that's now been in the news because perhaps it was part of the coronavirus sort of development. But one thing that they were focusing on I found really interesting, because there are already laws against pangolin trades in China, but they had realized that when poachers are intercepted with live pangolins or when scales are confiscated at customs, that sometimes the local officials who receive them, the wildlife stations, use it themselves or resell it. So they were they were concerned not only about what laws are passed at the sort of national level, but sort of down the chain, once something is confiscated, what happens. So it's a very complicated question to try to restrict wildlife trade, but it's obviously getting a lot more attention in part because of the coronavirus right now.
And regarding caterpillar fungus, which is an alternative livelihood for Tibetans in Qinghai, there was a report that came out a year or so ago that challenged the efficacy of it as a medicinal, and that report was quickly squashed.
And now, there was any other comments you want to make based on Mr. Jarvis's comments?
We've traveled with this tree quite a lot, and we always, when we travel to other countries and work with other park agencies or nascent park agencies, we know that our laws are going to be different than another country's laws. The culture is different. But the same frameworks are important. And sitting here listening to the courts waiting for NGOs to jump in, NGOs are watchdogs here in the United States for the national parks. But we have a very robust visitor and resource protection law enforcement division. We would not allow for illegal logging or water theft in our parks without us taking some litigation action. So it is a real big need in China that the central government needs to take more control over national parks if you want them to be national, not county. We understand that the counties manage everything. But the national parks need to be really a connection between the central government and the counties and the remote areas. Otherwise, they are just paper parks.
But it is nice when you said that the counties working with the local communities, but to have the central government. I mean, for example, like the park police that we have here. I mean, are you guys talking to Chinese government? I'm sure in your report talked about maybe potential training to scale up, these park police. And then I guess the question could be like, if you have these park police coming in, what happens to the patrol, these community patrollers who are maybe, you have to think about how do those two systems.
Well, those would be the first recruits for park ranger training. And when we call them community rangers, should be park rangers. So the training would be to them. You want folks to have those jobs. Most of the people who work for the Park Service are local people. They live in their communities across the United States. Only a few small cadres go across the country or change. So yeah, I mean, we had hoped to do some training later this year, but that is postponed.
It's postponed.
I mean, it's still early for getting in on this, but it is really important to have people who know how to manage a national park.
Yeah, I would like to add, I fully agree with Destry that if it's a national park system, national government need to take the lead and responsibility, and that's happening. I'm very glad to see it's happening, but transition will take time. As I said, the first draft of the national law on national parks has been developed and now is under public review and comments. And in terms of capacity building, actually, we are working closely with the Chinese government. One project we will implement this year, actually, is to help develop a strategic plan for capacity building for the whole system of national parks and protected areas. And we're also working with this personnel department of CPC to build more stronger capacity in national and local levels for the whole system. So it's happening.
Now, she's been so eager to ask a question. She's wearing a nice bright red for like almost Chinese New Year. So you can ask your question now.
Thank you so much for being here, for sharing this very exciting news. And I'm extremely excited because I see my hometown in the list. It's Qinghai Sanjiangyuan National Park. I'm very super proud also, you know. So, yes, being a Chinese.
So who are you?
Oh, okay.
We know where you live.
my name's Jian Chai Zhu, and currently I'm come from Eurasia Center.
Okay, good.
So, my question is, so what's the also my biggest concern? So, what's the biggest challenge for in terms of this pilot national park system, and what's the budget of government put in, and how does local community, because the violation, you know, maybe it's not the mean from the central government, but the local official, when they enforce the law, they, you know, make a trick, you know, so somehow hurting the local community. So how does this, you know, protect the local communities?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
So we covered some of that, but maybe you can add, you know, Buchong a little bit more about, you know, what are some of the other big issues that you see that, you know, that you guys want to be working on, and particularly to help the local communities to protect the parks.
For me, two biggest challenge for China's national park system all come from people. First one is really how do you take care of the local livelihood of the community who live inside or adjacent to the parks. Their livelihood and their interests need to be taken care of after establish the national parks, and land tenure is still a big challenge. Government will not have that much money to buy all the land or, you know, get all the collectively owned land to state-owned. So that's biggest challenge. Secondly is because China has such a big population, and visitor management will be a big challenge because you want national parks open to all the visitors, and if you don't manage the visitors well, the natural and cultural resources will be destroyed quickly. So those are the two biggest challenge I see.
Okay, how about you, Rudy? We're going down the line here.
Sure.
Even you, Boju, get ready to say what your big challenges you see coming on protecting the national parks.
I think it's money. There are 11 pilot national parks, but some of the most famous ones like Wangshan and Jiuzhaigou are not part of this pilot phase, and maybe not even in the next phase. They don't want to be part of the national park system. It's because they're already well established. They already have a strong revenue stream. They have too many people coming. So they don't see that they need the central government. Whereas Sanjiangyuan is a great pilot because it's showing the power of the central government, but also to put money into the local community and give local people alternative livelihoods as community rangers, as yak herders, as caterpillar fungus collectors, and all these different things. But to figure that out, that's something that's still difficult in our system, where although we do share money here, and we look at the investment in national parks as a 10-to-1 benefit to the country. $3 billion is given to our agency every year, and $32 billion is generated back to the local communities across the United States. That is an example that the Chinese see and they want to do for themselves. So we're trying to share how that all works for them.
Okay. What do you see as, this is the closeout. What do you see as the biggest challenge for, I guess, your...
Biggest challenge here, or one of the major challenges, is the enforcement, how the enforcement will and capacity can be. Because historically, the environmental enforcement agencies, particularly the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, or the MEE, was among the weakest agencies of them all. And by the way, as the economic weakens, they may get even weaker. So last December, we were invited to see various high-level MEE conference, and many senior MEE officials discussed about, the pork price. Say, well, many other agencies are blaming MEE, on the soaring pork price, and say, well, you guys, are closing down, the pork farms for environmental reasons. Now the pork price is so high, the inflation is terrible, and next year, you will be blamed for this failing economy. So they were quite worried back in December. Last December, and now we have new concerns here, definitely. But you can see that, so in the past few years, the Chinese environmental enforcement were getting stronger, but how sustainable it can be is still in a big question mark.
And with MEE as well, a lot of the enforcement's time and money is going more for pollution protection issues. And I've been kind of wondering, I'd love to see the breakdown of their budgets between, brown and green work. How about Boju, do you have one quick thing to say about what you see as the biggest problem, I guess, around your public interest lawsuit or EIA work? Fell asleep. We maybe lost the connection. Okay, Christina.
Okay, sure. Two thoughts. One, to pick up on Mr. Jarvis's point about the central government needing to take control. I think part of taking control is related to the money issue, right? Because basically, in order to train the staff to work in places and enable to feel that you can shut down illegal logging operations or water bottle facility, you need to have money so you aren't dependent upon these kinds of local businesses in order to operate the park. So I guess this sort of money and control, I'd say, is two sides of the same coin. The other issue, I think, is transparency. There's a lot of people involved, a lot of land involved. Of course, China does not have an independent media, and there's a lot of restrictions on foreign journalists. And also, we've heard about some really great NGOs, but they're mostly based in Beijing. They can use the internet to find information about different notices, but they are restricted in how much sort of independent verification about what's going on and how local communities are impacted. So those are the two things, money and transparency, I think.
A little bit on that last point, to end on a little bit of an optimistic note, knowing that Friends of Nature and Environmental Law Institute, like for the NGOs and the judges and lawyers, have been doing lots of training and support.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, there you are. Yes. Jump in.
I'm alive.
You're alive, yes. So you get to close us out.
About what worried, whether policies and plans can be effectively implemented, and the conflict of protection and the development brought about by the economic downturn in the following years. This is what I'm worried. For example, will ecotourism, because ecotourism is one of the policy, it's a way in the national park, but will ecotourism create another round of tourism infrastructure, such as hotels and big-scale tourist centers and high-level roads construction? Yeah, that's what I'm worried.
Okay, but we have worries, but don't want you guys walk out of here feeling glum. I think I'm excited because, when I look at what Poston and the National Park Service, ELI, independent journalists, and really Friends of Nature, one of the most dynamic NGOs in China, there's a lot more effort working on this, and it excites me. And also the China Environment Forum, we're going to have more meetings on biodiversity and hopefully yanking in the National Park Service yet again later this year. So come back for those stories. On Friday, we're also going a bit outside cities. We're going to have a meeting on rural climate action in the U.S. and China. So you could come back again on Friday. Scheduling made it a double whammy week. And on March 20th, we're screening the film The Story of Plastics, which is not a specific, well, China is part of the cradle to grave of plastics. So you could come and spend more of your mornings here. But before you leave, please some applause for my lovely speakers, both here and way far in Beijing.
Thank you.
And feel free to come up and ask them questions and do some elbow knocking. Thank you so much. That was awesome. You guys are fabulous. I mean, I could have just had just you two, but